Welcome back to Misconceptions. I am so thankful to have a wonderful colleague of mine. We actually met at a conference, and we actually did a previous recording for another organization a number of years ago, and I have asked him to come back. Welcome, Brennan Peterson. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
So, where are you joining me from? Where do you live?
I'm in Orange, California at Chapman University.
Okay, and you're a professor there.
Yeah, I'm a professor in the Department of Marriage and Family Therapy. So I teach graduate students. We're training them how to be therapists and spend a lot of time working with training them how to work with couples and then spend some time talking about fertility issues and fertility counseling issues too.
So that's where we originally met at the what's now called the Jones Infertility Conference. And I heard you speak, I think you were the keynote, speaking about men and infertility. And I really appreciated, first of all, the literature and the research that you presented. It wasn't just like opinion and perspective, it was really about a very research-based presentation. So I'd love for us to start there a little bit about what you've come to understand from your own research and publications. What have you come to understand about men and infertility? And I want to clarify if you're going to be talking about male factor infertility or men coping with infertility.
Yeah, that's a good distinction. So it's stressful both ways for men. So if they are diagnosed with male factor infertility, then that's a difficult adjustment for men. And if they are in a couple where their spouse is diagnosed with infertility or it's a combined factor infertility, that's still challenging and stressful. So in general, we'll kind of talk about it in as the same in terms of their like how they are dealing with infertility. But there's some unique issues with male factor infertility, particularly if they get and use donor insemination, then that's going to be kind of a subgroup of men and kind of the challenges that they go through with that. But in terms of the research about it, it's really interesting that in general, male infertility has been something that's been pretty misunderstood. And a lot of that has been because in research studies, it's been understudied. And that's not really because there's been a lack of studies that are really tried to aim at understanding men. It's a lot of it is that they're very reluctant to participate in studies to begin with. So it's a little bit of both. Like more studies were aimed at understanding the woman's experience, particularly early on. And then more studies were aimed at trying to understand men's experiences, and researchers began to find that men are just really reluctant to participate. And that's something that we've found pretty extensively is that recruiting them is really, really challenging. Um, but there's interesting developments in the field that have really showed that their experiences are more in depth and complex than people have originally thought. Because a lot of times men will underreport on like if they're doing like a depression survey on a paper pencil survey, oftentimes they'll it's not they don't report it as serious or as complicated. But if you find men in qualitative studies where they agreed to participate, or you find the use of like an online discussion board, which is really this interesting way in which men's voices have been heard, those feelings are common. It's common for men to be depressed. It's common for men to experience significant loss. So there's been a pretty wide variety of like a progression in the research, starting from really minimal to more common now, but there's still significant gaps and it's really significant and it's really hard to get them in to studies. So that's kind of a general overview, I
Yeah.
think.
When we talk about these studies, I'm wondering also about the diversity of the population that is willing to be studied. So it's hard enough to
Mhm.
get the men in the room. What is the complexity of getting diverse male population, represented in these kinds of studies?
Yeah, I think it's challenging across the board. This is like a global issue. Every country that I've ever read studies for, and anyone at an international conference that talks about male infertility really says similar things. That it's hard to involve men, and so much of that is based upon culture and the ways that people define masculinity. So in most cultures, masculinity is linked with virility, and it's linked with the sense of of being strong, and infertility is linked with weakness. And so oftentimes there's this whole segment of that links in with stigma and shame. And so then men are just much more reluctant or much less willing to talk about infertility issues with other people. So there's a sense of like they really don't want to talk about it with friends and family. They don't really want to talk about it much with certainly with like mental health professionals, and that leads to this difficulty of getting them to participate in studies. And so when we find some success in doing that, but there's always a selection bias because when you do get men who participate, they're oftentimes men who are maybe a little more open, a little more willing to be open. We did a recent study that found that like only like 11 to 12% of the participants had male factor infertility, which is really an underrepresentation. And our whole study was about openness and about stigma. So
Mm.
it's even interesting that men who probably experience that stigma more are less likely to, we just don't even know. So it's really hard to reach them in a way.
Hmm.
But what we do know and what we are learning from these different studies is this emotional reaction is pretty universal. Um, there are cultural differences that occur. And so if men are in certain cultures that really value and put a priority on masculinity, such as in China, where the male lineage comes to the paternal line, that is oftentimes linked with much greater shame and much greater sense of psychological distress. Or any type
Mm.
of pronatalistic country, people are oftentimes, men are more oftentimes feeling increased distress regarding their infertility.
Yeah, I imagine like the machismo, like that sense of like, where I'm not going to call it the patriarchy, but that idea, right? Like that idea of like the patriarchal kind of prevalence within a culture and society is going to impact how they experience their own inability to have children or challenge to create that family. I remember hearing, actually, it might have been at the same lecture where we were in. There was a woman who was speaking about her research in China, and it was like they weren't even testing the men. It was, the assumption was it was all women who worked. She was a research student. She was amazing. I don't remember her name, but she talked about the research that she did was all female based because the men weren't
Yeah.
even being tested.
Yeah.
Because the idea of being male, of having male factor actually, or that male contributes to the issue, was not a discussion. So tell me a little bit more about this idea of masculinity, how that is showing up, and how masculinity is connected to the shame piece or stigma. Like, what are you hearing? What is the language that they are sharing with you?
Yeah, and a lot of the qualitative studies, men will talk about the reason that it's so challenging is that infertility presents a challenge to their masculinity. And saying that I feel less of a man because of whether it's male factor diagnosis is oftentimes a very direct link, but it can even be I'm kind of failing in my role as a partner to be a helpful spouse. So like in heterosexual couples where this is occurring, men oftentimes feel like in this kind of unwinnable situation a lot of times where they want to protect their partner in this role of I want to be strong for my partner, but then they also suppress a lot of these emotions that they're having, which might be a lot of stress, a lot of feelings of loss, these kind of cherished assumptions about the future being challenged, and so they suppress those, but want to be strong for their partner. So their partner may feel like they're in it alone,
Yeah, very
even
much.
though their
Hmm.
partner's really working hard to try to support them. So that's another kind of threat to the masculine identity is I'm supposed to be strong, but how can I be vulnerable and open? And that's this struggle that really doesn't go away much. Um, but then the definition of just like you're weak if you talk about challenges. You're weak if you let stresses really impact you. And then this to the most extreme, like in some cases in countries in Africa, they're like the belief is that if the male is infertile, then that's a complete it's a complete elimination of their masculinity. All right.
Wow.
And oftentimes it can be that just like you were saying in China, where it's not even believed to be the case. Like men
Hmm.
really can't be infertile, and a lot of blame gets put on on women. And then when the men find out about this from doctors, they are kind of in this situation now of intense guilt. They feel terrible that their spouse is being blamed by everyone else, but these larger societal cultural forces are greater than just the individual saying, "Oh, this is an issue that I'm having," and
Yeah.
so all of those reasons go through why it really attacks masculinity.
Yeah, and I think about it from, the perspective of identity, but also if you think about it, I wish men would understand that all women want is their spouses to be vulnerable. Like you hear this all the time. She'll say, "I feel so alone," and he'll say, "I know, but I'm being strong for you," or as long as she's okay, I'm okay.
Mhm.
And really, the most beautiful thing or most profound experiences happen when he can share in that space with her and not feel like there's something wrong with him for having not wrong with him, but like he's actually meeting a need, that he
Yeah,
doesn't understand that he can meet her needs by being vulnerability is really attractive for women. And so when
yeah.
he can say to her, "I'm also sad. Yes, of course I'm having a hard time too," all of a sudden this compassionate connecting space can occur. I'm imagining you see that frequently as well.
Yeah, yeah, and it really speaks to the whole idea of just of the socialization of masculine scripts and norms.
Yeah.
Starting at very young ages, right? Where the ways that boys relate to each other and they don't have more in-depth conversations with each other, or when problems come up, they kind of the way that they cope with that is they joke around about it with each other. And so that happens as well. Like men are very reluctant to talk about it with their friends because they are afraid that their friends will just kind of, make light of it, make fun of them, all those common terms like, "Oh, you're shooting blanks," or whatever it is.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it leads them to feeling like, okay, can I really be open with my friends? And the truth is probably if they did, that their friends would be pretty supportive because when men really do express that level of vulnerability to a friend, the friends are oftentimes really understanding, and it kind of elicits that compassionate response, like, "Oh man, I can see that that's really difficult." So I think it is a real challenge. This whole idea of like socialization, that it's not as though like men are just I'm gonna just deal with this all on my own because I'm just such a strong person and I don't need anyone else. But it's this kind of like larger dominant discourse in society about like just how a man should be or should act, and that
Yeah.
comes from a million different messages.
I have to acknowledge I teach sexual abuse prevention in many of the Jewish day schools here in Philadelphia. And in one of the components of the curriculum, there's a video, and the clip is where an adult jumps onto this quadricycle. That's the word of the film, right? I don't even know if we use that terminology anymore, but jumps onto the bike, and the kids are going, and he's like, "Hey, I just want to take a picture of you." And then we ask the kids, "What should you do?" And I always tell the teachers in fifth grade, I'm like, "Watch what happens here." Every single fifth grade classroom, the boys will go, "I'm going to punch him. I'm going to kick him. I'm going to do taekwondo and karate." I'm like, they never even learned taekwondo and karate, but they're going
Yeah,
to hit
yeah,
the person, right? And we begin to understand why when fifth grade boys become young adult men who didn't say no to their victimizer, to their offender, who did not say no to their perpetrator, they begin to think like, "I should have fought back. I should have, like, it was my responsibility." The girls don't do that. The women say, the young fifth grade girls say, "We're going to get off the bike and run. We're going to run and tell an adult. We're going to get help." But the boys don't. And it's profound to see it consistent across every single school I teach in,
uh,
independent of religious level. It's really a unique thing where you now understand why, the statistics are like 1 in 10 to 1 in 20 men experience child sexual abuse. There's no way that's accurate. There's no way. We imagine it much closer to the 1 in 5 to 7 girls, who
yeah.
experience it. And so, but that speaks to that idea of that masculinity of like, how can I express that I didn't fight, that I'm weaker, or that I'm not as
uh,
strong as I imagine myself to be. Yeah.
yeah.
What are you learning a little bit about I want to pull apart that word stigma, because I think like it comes up so much, and I feel like we've come a long way when it comes to, I think we've come a long way from mental health stigma. I don't think we are where we were 10 years ago, 20 years ago, but yet with infertility, some people really have a difficult time understanding that use of the word stigma. They're like, "But like you didn't do anything wrong." Right. Or but this is just the way you were created. Like you didn't cause this to happen.
Yeah.
How do you see stigma experienced by people, especially men in particular, in this space?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And stigma is something that is a sense of otherness, or it's a sense of the fear of being judged by someone else. And that's that idea of like external stigma, for some kind of characteristic or some kind of situation that one is in. And then there's internal stigma, which is when someone really believes that whatever characteristic or situation that they're in causes them to be defective or less than or bad or whatever it is. So those two really work hand in hand. A lot of times the internalized stigma comes because of the externalized stigma that's found in a society. So what oftentimes happens for men in stigma is they feel embarrassed by their infertility, or they, again, it goes back into the same things we've talked about with masculinity in these scripts, like, oh, I'm less than, or I'm a failure as a partner, or I'm just not, I'm just not good enough, or what is it that I've done wrong to find myself in this situation?
Mm.
So when men feel that instead that sense of stigma, it's incredibly challenging because what stigma does is it suppresses the desire to talk about something even more so. So men are already reluctant to talk about challenges. It can even be something that's not very stigmatized, right? Like some kind of work stress or something else. But when now you have this level of like personal failure, like, oh my gosh, I can't help my partner have a child. So there's something completely wrong with me. I'm defective. My body's defective. I'm defective as a person. Or my partner, we're going through infertility together and she's, sad all the time and I can't help her. And I'm completely at a loss. I don't know what to do. So there's a
Mm.
sense of like feeling like a failure. And when that stigma is present for people, it results in secrecy, it results in lack of openness, and that just makes stigma even stronger. It just reinforces it. And so what we've done some research on is like the relationship between stigma and depression, and then stigma and then openness with other people, and depression and stigma and meaning, and kind of what these relationships are, kind of trying to disentangle a little bit about what happens there.
Where does shame show up in that conversation?
Think shame comes in when stigma is internalized and then
Mm.
it's really heightened. So someone then takes a sense of personal shame, like not only am I vulnerable to someone's judgment, and it's something unfavorable and I may be somewhat embarrassed about it, but shame is this deeper sense of like a core sense of I'm a failure, or there's something completely wrong with me as a person. So it's a little bit different. Like I think shame is that deep sense of personal inadequacy, and then stigma really kind of fuels that. But and it also doesn't have to, right? So some people may say, yeah, this is stigmatized and people don't talk about it, but that doesn't mean I'm a failure. So there's it's not a causal relationship, but it creates an environment where shame is more common when stigma happens. So stigma, secrecy, and shame, they kind of all work
Mm.
together, and that's the openness is the way out of that, right? Is being able to talk about it, being able, like, once you shine a light on something that's shameful or something that's a secret or something that's stigmatized, it really reduces the power of it and helps people move into that sense of more of more of an acceptance and more of a sense of wholeness.
I love that idea also because I think like I mean it's one of the motivations that I have for doing this podcast is so that we can start talking about the things that we like you just said to shine a light on so many of these issues. And I also think about many of the, I'm very involved, I'm a part of and involved in the Jewish community and the religious Jewish community, and they have absolutely highlighted, the necessity for support around loss and infertility with so many organizations, cancer survivors, children of cancer, like so many organizations are all developed within the community to support people that I do think reduces stigma. I mean, I remember in my own childhood, we never said the word cancer. It was like that diagnosis, they got sick.
Mhm.
We never actually even said the word. It was almost like
Yeah.
it wasn't necessarily stigma or shame, but it held its own power to it. And I think
Mhm.
about how that has completely changed in just 25, 30 years, how the culture has shifted in a way that now allows us to talk about a cancer diagnosis. I think we're still talking about a fertility diagnosis, but there's still a lot of secrecy and maybe privacy around that. I'm
Mhm.
wondering if any of the cultures that you've read about or interacted with do this better. Like, are you hearing of cultures or communities where there really has been a reduction in stigma and ultimately a reduction in shame when someone, especially men, are experiencing an infertility experience?
Yeah, it's interesting because Marcia Inhorn from Yale University has done some really interesting research on this. Like in the Middle East and in Mexico, they found that those are traditionally very um, strong, kind of either patriarchal or just like extreme kind of masculine societies. And they found that there's been a gravitating away from those just traditional views of masculinity towards a more integrated sense of masculinity where they can share more, they can be open more. And so that's a positive step in the right direction. And I think in other Western societies, like we're trying to move in that direction, like you're mentioning, like that, we're moving away, hopefully, from stigma, but it's still so strong. Um, and what oftentimes is needed is like public figures in a sense, like coming out and talking about it is a really powerful way to destigmatize
Yeah.
something. And
Yeah.
that doesn't happen. Like if you look at the people who talk about infertility issues, it's more common, but it's
Women.
usually women,
All
and
women. Yeah.
it's usually about female fertility, or if it's a male, it's about like, oh, I'm supporting my partner. It's
Yes.
so rare to have a man come out and say like, yeah, I was diagnosed with infertility. My sperm count is zero. I can't have a child, and here's what that's been like.
Yeah.
Like, I think what you're going to need is our, and I think that's happened on a few times, but you need like a larger scale. Uh, you need just more men to,
And we need a more,
yeah,
bigger influencer. Yeah, we need a real
yeah,
influencer to come out. It's interesting because I always think I so admire the women that have come forward about their infertility and their challenges to have a baby or their pregnancy losses. And I remember when Michelle Obama talked about her own fertility experience and loss experience, and I was like, I wish you had done it in the office. Like I admire her a lot, and I just wish that you had done it while in office. She only talked about it after they were no longer president and wife of the president, and it was like, gosh, I wish you could have used your platform as the president's wife to highlight some of these issues around miscarriage and fertility challenges, but she chose not to for whatever reason. But I agree with you. I think that and we talk about this a lot in some of the trainings I give, that the value of speaking up, of like really using their voice, these people that have chosen to use their voice in these spaces. But you're right, the men are not there. The men are really, really quiet. And it's always about supporting the partner. Yeah.
yeah. And there's interesting research that basically is showing, and kind of where we started. There was a 2017 study in Italy by a physician, Alessandra Babor, and she looked at male factor infertility and about like 170 men who are going through treatments for male factor infertility. And she looked at the relationship to depression. And a lot of times we've always said like, okay, well, male factor infertility is linked with depression. And so but what the most interesting part about her study was, it wasn't a one-to-one with the male factor infertility. So there wasn't a difference in depression levels between male factor infertility, female factor combined. But what they then looked at was in that male factor infertility, there was a group of men who were open with others about it, and there were a group of men who were not open with others about it. And that's where they found the depression
Mm,
relationship. It was when men were not open about it that depression went up.
yeah.
So that for us as in a research team that I've been working with, we took that question and said, okay, well, would that continue to play out? Let's look at that from another, in another study. And so we wanted to see if we could replicate that. And we studied and this gives you an example of how hard it is to recruit men. But we had a large scale study, and we had 458 women participate, and we had 89 men participate.
Hmm.
And so it was, and that was with additional efforts to recruit men, where it was incredibly targeted for, we need men to participate in the study. And it's really kind of stunning when you always read about it. Okay, it's hard to recruit men, but in the amount of time and effort we put in and how challenging it really is to get
Yeah.
men to participate. So we have this study and we had the 90 men, but what was enough men where we could produce some meaningful analyses. And when we looked at the relationship between one, we kind of we did some regression analysis where we kind of had like four steps. We did like demographics, infertility related variables, stigma, and then openness. And when we got to the stigma, that produced a relate that were, up and beyond demographics and infertility related variables. It explained more of the variance in depression. So there's a relationship. The more stigma that men experience, the higher levels of depression they have. And
Hmm.
then when we added openness into the model, you would think sometimes that openness may or may not contribute something up and beyond stigma, but it contributed a significant amount up and beyond stigma. And it even had the largest effect in the entire study, which is the more men were open, the fewer depressive symptoms that they had. So
Hmm.
as men increased their openness, their depression symptoms went down. And it was a really kind of a striking finding where we thought, man, this is really important to know about.
Yeah.
Uh, and then it kind of begs the question about like, well, okay, we know that openness can be really positive, um, but there's some openness is really great, but then not all openness is great. So it's not we just can't say like just be open and tell everyone in the world,
Well, I was
right?
going to ask you that. Like, how do you
Yeah.
measure openness? I was going to ask you how you measure stigma, but come back to that. How do you measure openness? Like, how do you define it within your research study?
Yeah, it was defined by there was a couple different ways. Openness with other people, which is they have friends that they can rely on, or they share their problems with family and friends, or they feel like they can talk with other people. And then openness with partner.
Mm.
And what was interesting in our study was openness with partner really didn't contribute significantly to the study findings at all. It was really openness with people outside of that partnership because their partner
Yeah.
already knew they were
Yeah.
going through it,
Right.
right? So it's a sense of, okay, can I tell my family and friends about it? Can I tell people who are important to me? Can I tell a trusted other person? It's very similar to social support, but it's the idea that they're actually doing that, right? They're
Hmm.
engaging
Hmm.
in it.
Right.
So
Right.
yeah, go ahead.
No. So how do you measure stigma? I'm just, how do you, like, what are some of the quantitative, like, components of measurement that you measure stigma as well in that study?
Yeah, stigma was basically like there's different types of stigma. So there's like public stigma, personal stigma. This was more personal stigma, which is what like I feel embarrassed about my infertility. I feel like a
Okay.
failure. I feel
Okay.
inadequate. So that's inner sense of
Uh-huh.
self-judgment, that kind of
Hmm.
internalized sense
Hmm.
of stigma. So it was kind of you would expect that they would be inversely related, right? The more stigma one experienced, the less openness they would, and the more openness, then the less stigma. So and that's really what we found. But we found
Yeah.
that we didn't look at really stigma and openness as much as we did stigma and openness as they were related to
To
depression
depression.
and
Hmm.
meaning.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah. And
Tell me
so,
more about meaning. How do you mean, what do you mean by meaning in this case?
yeah, there's a great Michael Steger has a meaning in life questionnaire, and it's 10 items broken into two parts. One is the search for meaning, and the other is the presence of meaning.
Mm.
And oftentimes in Western cultures, the search for meaning is linked with less well-being or more uncertainty. It's oftentimes a dichotomous relationship between like, okay, if I'm searching for meaning, that must mean that there's something else that's missing from my life. And in Eastern cultures and in Asian culture, oftentimes there's not that dichotomous distinction, and the search for meaning can be linked with positive outcomes, like the presence of meaning is as well. But the presence of meaning in is more about like I know what my life's purpose is. I understand, the meaning that I have for my life. So we would anticipate a relationship between the more stigma one had. Our hypothesis was stigma would be related to like higher stigma is going to be related to higher search for meaning because they're questioning, they're feeling that sense of inadequacy. Well, what is the purpose of my life? I thought my purpose was going to be to have a child, and if I can't, what does that mean? We would anticipate some search for meaning being common. I mean, it's really
Sure.
unavoidable, right?
Right.
But then the presence of meaning would be this sense of stability, this sense of like, well, I know what my purpose is. And that oftentimes can be like an anchor for people through challenging times or through
Hmm.
adversity. So that's really what we found is that stigma was related to increased search for meaning and decreased presence, but also openness was related to the increased presence of meaning.
Hmm.
So that's one of the reasons why we really think that
Hmm.
openness is valuable because even in maybe it's not just like I'm talking about it and I feel relief, but maybe there's a relationship between as I talk about it, in that storytelling process, in the constructing a narrative about my experience, I'm creating some kind of meaning or some kind of new meaning. And that's a theme that's in all of the infertility literature. When people can
Mm.
when people can create new meaning, and they oftentimes that's through like acceptance, it's through really this generation of like a new purpose in life, or this adversity, like I've found something new, then that is linked with the most positive outcomes, like the less psychological stress and all of the well-being.
Wow, this is absolutely fascinating. And I just throughout my mind, or my mind is running through certain cases and connections with people that I've had over the years where, the essence of our therapy was an identity of living a meaningful life, of I don't feel like my life has any purpose or any meaning because I cannot have children.
Yeah.
And how that ties. And yet I'm also thinking about the value what I'm hearing you say is this value of openness can impact all these other components, right? Like the likelihood is that if I'm open, I think about it as I have good friends, like really, then I can call a friend and be like,
Yeah.
I need to run something through with you. And I'm not asking necessarily even for advice, although sometimes I am, but I'm just like, can I run this through? Tell me where I'm missing something, or like, that friendship offers me a perspective that I may not have on the situation I'm in. So
Hmm.
beyond just compassion, they might also be able to highlight something I'm missing in my life, in my relationship, in my difficulty, and whatever that is. So I imagine if you have a friend or a supportive partner, a person, not
Yeah.
not like a committed partner, but a friendship partner who gives you a reflection of like, hey, 1 second, your life holds meaning to me or in the world, or like you don't see this about yourself, suddenly you have a reflection of your identity that you really never perceived before, that could be so extraordinary in creating this meaningful life even if you cannot have children.
Yeah, yeah, and
So interesting.
that's a great point. And Sofia Gamero from Cardiff University has done some really good research on the transition to non-parenthood. So of like
Mm,
all of the people who go through fertility treatments, their estimates were that about 60% will have a child, about 10% will adopt a child, and about 30% won't have a child. And in that 30%, they're going through this transition to non-parenthood. So and they found that those that were more successful in that adjustment were those that could find meaning. I mean, that was the
yeah,
core task, right? Was about
for
like
sure.
how they found meaning, and how they found meaning through acceptance, and how they found meaning through a new purpose and other areas of their life where they could expand. And they have to they have to go back and challenge those old assumptions about what is like exactly what you said. And if they can do that, then there's this sense of like renewed purpose and
Mhm.
a greater sense of meaning in their life.
Yeah. I think it's so challenging in that, especially living in a deeply religious culture, the identity of parenthood is from
Yeah,
childhood. I joke about it like we have a holiday coming up called Purim, which is the celebration of the Book of Esther, which many of my listeners might be familiar with. And part of that is getting dressed up. And from the very youngest of age, my children, whatever they were dressing up as, they were also pregnant. So if they dressed up as a funny character, the character was pregnant. This is before I started doing work in infertility, but this was
yeah,
something where it just like it was so much a part of the little girl identity, was being a mommy and pushing a baby carriage and being pregnant, and
yeah,
to reorient to that sometimes in their 20s and 30s and 40s even, it's such a cultural exposed loss in many ways. And
yeah,
also it's like I have to almost like not just reorient to living, as you said, to non-parenthood, but also a total flip of identity, of this is who I thought this is the only meaningful way of living, is with a family and with children. And now you cannot, I have a hard time in sometimes convincing them otherwise. And
yeah.
it's not really my job to convince them otherwise, but I very much see it as a part of the therapeutic process, is beginning to explore a meaningful life independent of children. I imagine you're familiar with Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. And I actually was thinking recently, I wonder if I should do a book club, for especially for men and for women separately, who are dealing with potentially not having a child of their own, and learning, kind of taking that literature and that, wisdom into what now, because I think for many, many people, it's like that. From what else that I wonder also about, as we are a culture or community, Are there any ideas that you have about how we can change things? I'm always thinking practical, sometimes a little too practical, but for the men that we are talking about, for our little boys that we're talking about, what can we do differently that maybe offers this space for openness or, this reduction in stigma around identity and fatherhood or masculinity and fatherhood? Like, is there something we can change on the real micro level rather than just macro?
It's so interesting. I think at that micro level, like parenting, having been a parent myself, and my son is now 24, and when when he was younger, being a therapist, I'm encouraging, emotional expression, and I'm encouraging all these different,
Right.
it's
Our
okay to
poor
feel this
children,
way.
right? Our
Yeah, right,
poor
right,
children.
right.
Oh,
He'll
how
tell
they
his own
suffered.
therapist all about that, right?
I always say I'm going to pay for the therapy anyway, so it's fine. You can tolerate your mother.
Totally.
Yeah.
And what I was stunned by was how powerful the social scripts were. Like it didn't really matter, honestly. Like I'd
Yeah.
given him all these messages. He was like, no, that means I'm weak. And I'm like, wow. I mean, I've
Right.
never once taught you that, but somehow so at some level, it needs to be this larger cultural change, which I think is so challenging. So it
Yeah.
starts at the micro, like hopefully you have enough changes in the family and just in those kind of interactions between parents and kids that let them know that.
Mm.
I think at the level when you get to, say, adulthood and when men are walking into a fertility specialist office, there's things that they can do to really, I think, facilitate that process. And we talk about that in a chapter that we talk about like the language of invitation is a great one. So men oftentimes feel like they are really not allowed to participate in the treatments that much. They feel awkward doing it. They feel sometimes since the treatments are so focused on a woman's body, even if it's male factor infertility, they feel relegated to the sidelines. So if providers can even invite men to participate and say, we know that this can be challenging, and oftentimes for men it can feel like you're relegated to the sidelines, but your involvement is actually really important and needed. Then oftentimes just that invitation that's been
Mm.
shown in some studies that gives men the sense of permission and they can be more involved because they're not kind of self-relegated. And also just like informing them about the challenges that they're going to go through tends to help them be more open, more involved in the process. So there's different things like studies have basically found, first of all, like men are, in the US are 2 to 2.5 times less likely to go to see a physician than a woman. So they're just less likely to reach out and do any kind of help seeking anyhow. But when they do go to a doctor, they've found that they are more willing to accept information that's written, and they're more willing to accept information from their provider, like their healthcare provider, particularly about fertility, than they are from, say, their partner or from a mental health provider. So
Mm.
fertility, like fertility staff and counselor or fertility, like nurses and the front office people and the doctors can do a lot by giving men information, linking them with good websites that are resources that basically highlight here's what you could expect along the journey. And then it can talk about those things about masculinity and socialization and the challenges that they may experience and how they probably will find themselves not wanting to talk about it. So when that happens, then that can again kind of it normalizes it and they're like, oh, this is kind of common. I can see that. And then the next step, I think, is finding ways to provide that support. So, in the idea of openness, all openness is not great, right? So it's in the sense of like you're choosing who to be open with. So there was
Right.
a really interesting study that came out of Brazil where men who were or couples who were really some couples used discrimination in who they would talk to because they would say this what we would be open with these particular friends and they were rejecting and they were shaming and they were not helpful. So
Right.
it's a sense of like learning to use a discrimination about like who's going to be supportive and helpful,
Yeah.
and that's really vital. And for men, this use of let's say like qualitative studies, that's this next level of a researcher gets like 20 men and does an in-depth interview and hears their experiences and kind of finds these common themes. But something that's even more interesting in a lot of ways is when people will go do like a content analysis of men's online blogs or their discussion boards about fertility related issues. And what's really interesting here is that we know that men are much less likely to get in a group and want to participate face to face. But when they have the anonymity of a computer or the internet and they can post something or
Hmm.
they can post a question and seek support and they can even offer support,
Yeah.
then this whole world kind of opens up where all these experiences start coming out, right? Like
Yeah.
I feel like less of a man. I feel like a failure to my partner, and other men saying, "Hey, I felt that way too. It's going to get better. You know, you're in the toughest stretch." So there's this sense of a supportive community online, which is really a powerful thing for people. And so one of the things we can do too is link men to those resources
Those
to
first.
help.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Can
Mhm.
I ask you a question? Do you think that it feels like, is it just as beneficial if they're listening to support, or there really has to be the interaction? So, for example, if we often do workshops about infertility for men, and it's anonymous, nobody, it's just an audio call, but they're not participating. And
Mhm.
I'm wondering if there's still any kind of I
Mhm.
know there's emotional value, but I'm wondering if there's like that, the kind of quantity, like, could you measure that this openness or at least receptivity reduces stigma or potentially even helps with depression? Like, I wonder if you have to be interactive in order to experience the benefit of openness.
Mhm. So in the group that you're doing, then they're just kind of listening to
They're
other
listening to
people.
right, or they're listening to a lecture talk about their own experience, or how to take care of themselves, or how to, and acknowledging how difficult it might be. Like, we do a
Yeah.
lot of these workshops, but they're not for the men, they're not interactive as much as for the women,
Yeah.
right? The women might be more participatory. I just
I
wonder,
would,
if you don't have that
yeah.
reciprocity, do you lose the value, or is it not as valuable?
I would think that there is value in their participation, but I would guess that it's less valuable than if they are constructing their own sense of meaning and
Mm,
labeling their own experience and talking about it. There is
yeah,
something very powerful about that from this perspective in any kind of a therapy relationship. That's really what we're doing, right? Is they're looking within and they're taking their subjective experience and they have to use language to convey what they are going through. And that
yeah,
process is really important and really vital. And that oftentimes is what's responsible for reducing distress, is that kind of creation of a narrative that
yeah,
seems to make sense and you're kind of bringing things together. Now
right.
that can happen by just listening to other people, but I think there's something
I agree.
intensely powerful when people are able to do it themselves.
Right.
And on when they do this online, it's interesting because they can be seeking support, um, they can be providing support, but then there's this other element called like receiving support, which I think is really interesting and kind of goes unsaid, that men oftentimes don't know how to receive support. I've had men in my office say, like, I don't know what to do with that. Like someone gives me a compliment about something and I'm uncomfortable. I don't know what to do with it. And in on these online ones, they would say, like, the reception is like, thank you so much for your advice, or thanks for sharing your words. I feel better. It feels good to
Mm,
know that I'm not alone.
yeah.
So it's all three of those types of support are able to be processed through that. So I think there's a lot of value in linking men to places where they can be participating with other
Yeah.
people. Yeah.
It's exceptional. I will share with you one thing. There was an organization that I volunteer with and consult with on pregnancy loss, and they recently did an event that it really was a fundraiser event for men to get together, and it was a fundraising for a large preparation for a large campaign. And she said within minutes, the men were one next to the other. What did you go through, and how long ago was your loss? And my wife was 32 weeks along, and hours and hours later, they were still sitting at the table. So maybe we
Mhm.
just call it a fundraising meeting, and we would be very successful in getting men to the table. But she said the fundraising meeting turned into a beautiful, beautiful moments of connection
Ah,
and the expression of the narrative of, this is what I experienced. And it was safe to do among their friends, right, that looked like them, that shared this experience, that shared this loss, and it was really, I think we're onto something in that way, but it really something to consider. As we wrap up our conversation today, I'm wondering about if you can identify some misconceptions about men and infertility that we could, kind of dispel as we're talking about this issue.
Yeah, I think the biggest one is that infertility is not stressful for men. Infertility doesn't affect them negatively. When I entered the field in the late 90s and early 2000s, that was a lot of the narratives in the research was that women are much more deeply affected than men. And that's a lot of those reasons that it was those quantitative studies that men tended to underreport, men tended to have smaller samples. They tended, a lot of them weren't even recruited. So you didn't have this. And when we started getting these qualitative studies, we really started seeing, oh man, like these things, like men are talking about depression. Men are
Yeah.
really saying like, I feel a deep sense of loss. I feel a deep sense of like, I wanted to always have a child to mentor, to teach, to pass on traditions. And the
Mm,
fact that I can't have that, I feel devastated. Like the words that we don't associate that men typically are not
right.
going to say in face-to-face interactions, right? Um, so I think that's probably the biggest misconception is that it's not hard on men.
Mm,
There was a recent study that I read where one of the quotes was so similar to what a woman would say in previous studies, which was going past a park and seeing kids play at the park was so challenging. I stopped doing that because it
yeah.
just left me feeling terrible. It left me feeling so lonely and depressed. And that was a man who was saying that in this study. And so that's the sense of like, there's more going on. They may not show it, whether the socialized mask of like, I'm fine, I'm going to be strong, but they're
Mhm.
internally they're going through a lot.
Or like, what do you want me to say? Like I hear that a lot. Like, what do you want me to
Mhm.
say? Yeah,
Right,
yes, I'm not happy. What do you want me to say?
right,
Right. And their wives are pushing, pushing, and they're like, what do you want me to say? I'm not happy about life. I'm not happy with where we are, but I'm sad. But okay, what do you want me to say? It's just an
right.
interesting, right? Exactly.
Yep.
I do want to ask you one other question, but if you have another misconception, I'm happy to take it. But I do want to, you keep mentioning only depression. And I feel like a lot of the things I see in women is really anxiety as well. Like, will this ever be okay? Are you measuring for anxiety along with depression at the same time, or it's totally different?
Yeah, no, we have done it. I haven't done as many analyses. I did a study on anxiety and sexual stress a number of years ago, and we did find a big relationship there. And that's something we haven't even talked about. But
Right.
if men are diagnosed with male factor infertility, they have much more anxiety about the sexual relationship, much
Sure.
more worry about it. Yeah, so that's
Yeah.
definitely linked, and also the worry about the future for
Yeah.
sure. There
Yeah.
have been these interesting, like kind of long-term studies that have shown that men where their psychological distress goes down, even in the case where they don't have children, they tend to rebound to prior levels of not having distress years later. So it's the
Hmm.
idea of like longitudinally, they don't typically have the long-term effects, which is I think good
Oh,
news
so
too.
interesting.
Yeah, which is good is that men who and it's for both it's men who become fathers and men who don't become fathers, they tend to find a way to kind of get back to that baseline level that they were
Mm.
at before. But yeah,
But I don't
anxiety.
think, but I don't wouldn't say that women do. Do you find that was the study? Have you seen a study about women's ability to kind of come back to whatever that baseline was before if they do not have children?
I've seen both. I've seen both, but there have been some longitudinal studies that show that loss can be long term, and certain
Yeah.
things never do quite get back to a place where they were.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hmm. Okay. Any last misconceptions that you want to dispel before we close up for today?
Um, I think just that idea that like for men to be open about it, like again, how do you get that for men? And so one of the things that fertility counselors can do, I think, they can use like written expression, like writing
Mm.
interventions can be really helpful. So if they want to just journal about something, right? And that sense of like sometimes being put on the spot, like, yeah, like what you're saying, what do I say? I don't know what to say about it. Or if they can use like if you're working with a couple, they could use a written intervention where if a man can like have some time to gather his thoughts and kind of write down exactly what he's experiencing and then read that to his partner in a session or share that with her. Oftentimes that can be a bridge to connection. And there's different things that we can do too with like, say certain communication strategies. It's not always about the sense of like men just trying to fix something and not and using that problem-oriented communication. It can be the sense of like men can have a lot of empathy for their partner, and but sometimes those interactions are systemic and these conversations that are trying to be helpful go south for couples. And so we can use good communication strategies and training to help couples improve their communication about fertility related challenges, to help them feel like they're on the same team. Because
Mm-hmm.
what we're really trying to help people do is like move away from this sense of like, um, he experiences it this way and I experience it this way, and we're so different. We're on different teams. It's trying to be on the same team, but maybe it's accepting the differences in how you present
Yeah.
and maybe how you cope, but also finding the empathic connections through that.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of room for that. It's not to say that if couples are really struggling, that they need to have the very same experience. You know, I had a couple once where I was working with them, and the wife said, like, I want him to experience this in exactly as I am because I feel so alone. Like he needs to feel it the way I do,
Right.
and that makes sense at some level,
Right.
right?
Sure.
But it's
Right.
also not realistic, right? You
Right.
can't
Right.
force someone to experience the world way you do.
Right. Right.
So, but what we worked towards was acceptance of the difference, respect of the difference, empathic connection with the difference still there. So
Mm-hmm.
the difference becomes a opportunity for connection instead of it being something that's a barrier. You say, okay, we see this differently. Let's try to understand each other's experience in a way that provides this increased understanding where we can connect around it rather than it
Mm-hmm.
just being
Mm-hmm.
something that always drives us apart. So and that's really possible. And I think that, and again, maybe the last thing is that I think that men want to they want to navigate this as well as they can, right? They want to support their partner. They want to do a great job with this, and they may not want to just talk about it all the time, and they may not know what to say about it. But
Right.
just finding the avenues where they can express
Right.
openness and get support, I think is the key.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you so much for spending some time with me. This was a fascinating conversation. I enjoyed, even with all the literature and data points, it was like amazing. And you explained that really, really clearly and well. And I look forward to hearing the feedback from the audience as they get to learn like I just did. So thank
Oh,
you.
absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. It was a real pleasure.